What makes you uproariously cheer? What makes you get off your seat and onto your feet and applaud? What makes you take to the streets or get off your couch to demand answers from your politicians? Straight ahead, we're tracking the mood of the Metro, its comings and goings, its most impactful stories. It's your week reviewed. Next.
Week in Review is made possible through the generous support of Dave and Jamie Cummings, Bob and Marlise Gorley, Smithfield Foods, Haas and Wilkerson Insurance, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, I'm Nick Haynes, and as we were off last week as we celebrated the 4th of July, we're giving you 2 weeks in review for the price of one, and that is an amazing deal. That means double the pithy insights of our news reviewers from 41 Action News anchor and reporter Dia Wall, from KMBC 9 News, chief political reporter Michael Mahoney, tracking the news from behind a microphone at KCMO Talk Radio, Pete Mundo, and Kansas City Star columnist and editorial writer Dave Helling. We start in Kansas this week, where, using the words of former President John F. Kennedy, Chris Kobach officially announces he's running for the United States Senate.
We all have to heed what JFK said and ask what we can do for our country, because our country needs us. And that's what brings me here today. Today, I am announcing my candidacy for the United States Senate.
The former Kansas Secretary of State becomes the 5th declared candidate and the 3rd Republican to formally launch a campaign to succeed Pat Roberts, who announced he will not seek re-election to the Senate next year. How does Kobach's entry into this race change the dynamics of this campaign, Pete?
Well, right away, he becomes the frontrunner, simply because of name ID. Now, that doesn't mean he's maybe the best candidate to win a general, but he's absolutely right now the frontrunner because people know who he is, which can be a good thing, or in Chris's case, it can be a not so good thing. A lot of concern about whether or not he's the right guy based on how poorly the 2018 campaign was run. Bad grassroots. I have a lot of people that told me, I tried to volunteer, I tried to give them money, I never heard back from anybody. Chris said on my show this week that he's got a whole new team around him, new people, new campaign manager. It's a good start, but I'm not quite sure he's still the best guy in a general.
But Pete says he's the front runner, Michael.
All of this has to be written in soft lead pencil until we know what Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is going to do. He's a Wichita native, and he has never closed the door completely on whether or not he would run for the Senate. And there are an increasing number of signs that Pompeo is thinking or rethinking his quasi-Sherman-esque statement that he wouldn't run. And he might get into this race. If he gets into this race, the dynamics of this thing change. If he doesn't, there are going to be several candidates, and a candidate can win that Republican primary with maybe 30% of the vote. If Mike Pompeo gets into the race, and he might, then it's a game changer, and the dynamics change a great deal, and there might not even be a contested primary.
Just like the presidential race, Dia Wall, what I'm seeing consultants and experts now saying, oh, it's far too early, 16 months down the road to be predicting who's going to win this. Isn't that the same with a U.S. Senate race in Kansas more than a year away?
Yes, because people don't have long memories when it comes to politics or really anything anymore. And to Pete's point, just because you're a good candidate in a primary doesn't mean you're going to be the right fit when it comes to the general election. I'll be very curious to see who else gets in the race and what it looks like, let's say, a year from now.
Jerry Moran, the other United States Senator in Kansas, saying, you know, he is open-minded about this. He could see a path to victory for Chris Kobach. Dave?
Well, yeah, particularly in the primary. And then, of course, once the primary ends, you'll have to see who the Democrats nominate, and whether there's a competitive race or not will depend, at least in part, on whether the Democrats come up with a credible candidate. But Mike talked a little bit about Mike Pompeo, and he's right in terms of that being the unanswered question here. Mike Pompeo has time. He, unlike the other candidates, can wait maybe until the first 3 or 4 months of next year before declaring. He could raise all the money he wants. He would get a lot of support from the Trump crowd. My guess is that if polling shows Chris Kobach leading the Republican field well into next year, the pressure on Pompeo to get in will be immense from Republican regulars. I've never seen a major candidate for office, face such strong opposition from within his own party as Chris Kobach has in the last 2 weeks.
But Pete, you were talking to Chris Kobach this week. It seems hard to believe this is a very intelligent, good communicator man. He wouldn't get into this race if he didn't think he could win it.
No, and he was fairly contrite about the mistakes that were made. When I had him on a few months ago, he basically blamed the money. He got hammered on the education front. He didn't take much personal responsibility for the failures. He did this week. I was surprised by that. Now, whether or not that changes anything, we don't know yet. But he was far more contrite than I frankly expected him to be based on the failures of last year.
But at the same time, Pete, as you know, in the gaggle with reporters after the Leavenworth speech, he went back and said, you know, the reason I lost is because they were banging me really hard on education and it was inaccurate and everything like that. So in your interview, where he was more contrite about it, to other reporters the day that he announced up in Leavenworth, he was still saying, hey, look, I got beat on education and they beat me because they were ripping me and it was negative. So he's still hanging on to some of that.
And let's not forget, too, the issues in the U.S. Senate race versus the governor's race, far different. And Chris's issues 1, 2, and 3, immigration matters a lot more in a Senate race than a governor's race.
Next up, is it just delaying the inevitable, or is it a final fix now on the horizon? This week, Jackson County extends the deadline for property tax appeals. Thousands of angry homeowners now have an extra 3 weeks to officially make known their unhappiness with the valuation of their homes. Some people say their home values have gone up fourfold, and it's going to force them out if nothing is done. Monday, July 29th is the new deadline date. So what are the options? Is it halt the entire process? B, start all over again? C, force cities, our libraries and school districts to reduce their property tax rates to lessen the punch? D, recall the head of Jackson County government, Frank White? E, simply use the current appraisals and put a cap on the increase that can take place this year? Or F, something completely different, dear Wall?
Well, people are throwing all of them out right now. I don't know how feasible all of them are, but at the end of the day, yes, there are calls for Frank White to get out of there. Yes, there are calls to put a cap in place. The problem is these are things that are legislative and should have been done and on the books before this happened. In 2013, I believe, when they had this whole issue, the county appraiser had to resign among all of the drama and kerfuffle. They've had over 20,000 people as of the last time we covered this, which I guess would be a few days ago, a few weeks ago, who filed these appeals. I don't know how much headway they're going to get, because people that I've talked to from outside the county say these numbers are probably more accurate. They should have been raising them on an incremental basis, but now it just looks like the chickens are coming home to roost.
With just delaying this now by 3 weeks, is that just a delay of the inevitable and we're not really fixing anything?
It's a postponement, and that's all it is. The county went into a program starting in 2015 and was supposed to end in 2021, when they were supposed to be incrementally increasing the property taxes. Instead, they got it to after 2017, decided we need to get closer to market value and get there quicker, and so boom, we have this bump in 2019. Now, in terms of remedies, about the only one that is feasible and the only one that is legal is if the taxing jurisdictions, the local governments and the school districts, roll back their levies so that the tax rates go down, and the amount of tax that taxpayers would pay would remain relatively equal. This idea of restarting reassessment or capping things, probably not a
But rolling back the tax rates.
Rolling back the rates.
But that seems much more complicated, though, because it's not just one city. There are multiple cities. Lee Summit, Blue Springs, Kansas City, Missouri. Tons of school districts, multiple library districts who would have to all go along with this plan.
Well, yeah, but each of them has an individual ability to roll back their own levy based on the increased valuation figures that are reported to that jurisdiction, the counties, the cities, the school boards, the mental health levy. And Mike's right. It's the one thing that could be done without state authorizing legislation. In fact, under the Hancock Amendment, it has to be done for some jurisdictions, or at least capped at some level. Remember, if your appraisal doubles but the rate is cut in half, it's a zero impact on you. So you have to look at both sides of the equation. The other remedies, in terms of phasing in appraisal increases, are going to be unfair to someone. People who have been under or overappraised over the years have a beef with those who have been underappraised. So property taxes are a mess. They're based on a guess. We've talked about that before, of what your home is worth. And by the way, you don't receive any value from that until you sell. So it's hard for people to understand it. But roughly, I think we're going to get there.
Pete, when we think about people's focus on issues, it always seems to be focused on Congress, the White House, what is happening in Washington, D.C. Is this an illustration that some of the most important things that affect your lives actually happen with people in your own backyard, your local political leaders?
It used to be. I mean, people would vote for different parties at the state level versus the federal level. Now it's all coming from the top down. in D.C., and that's disappointing. It's part of what's happened with local media coverage and budget cuts and things like that. It's far more in depth than we want to get into. But yeah, I mean, the most important issues are happening in your backyard, and we have to all remember that.
This has been, real quick, this has been my mantra for years, is the fact that people can talk till their tongues fall out about national politics and things that they don't know that much about. But when the rubber hits the road in your city council races, your county races, assessment, that's where people should be paying attention, because that's the stuff that they can affect directly. And almost nobody acknowledges that.
It's a summer of free in Kansas City. Free money, that is. Mayor-elect Quinton Lucas says he's backing plans to make buses free in the city. He's also championing the Kansas City Library's decision to eliminate all library fines. The summer of free money continued at City Hall, where the council voted to give the new mayor-elect a pay raise this week of nearly $20,000 a year and a $10,000 raise for themselves. I noticed that Quinton Lucas wasn't there for the council vote on pay raises. Does that mean he's going to refuse to take the money, Dearwall?
Would you? Let's just keep it real. Okay, here's the deal. One, I talked to the incoming mayor about free bus service. He says the city already invests about $55 million in bus service now. It's really not that much more expensive to make it free for everybody. Okay, we can accept that maybe. The pay raises, Quinton Lucas did come out and say he was against, but he was not there for the vote. And honestly, when we did the story, nearly every council person we talked to said that they were not necessarily in favor of the raises, but lo and behold,
Clearly they did.
they passed.
Yeah, we had Quinton Lucas on our show on Friday, and we had a Heather Hall, councilwoman, on the show as well, and they were both similar stance, not in favor of it. But are you not going to take the money, to Dia's point? No, you're going to take the money. We're all going to take the money at some point. But I think when you look at it, coming off the last 6 months and the problems that the city has faced, potholes, homicide rate up year over year, 10 where it was last year. It's a bad look right now to be given and justifying that 15% raise.
Some people say, well, it's really just a small percentage of the entire budget. As Dia points out about bus fares, well, it's not going to cost that much. But when I was looking through Quinton Lucas's Twitter account since he's been elected, he's also talking about he meets park workers and they say, oh, they all need a pay raise. He speaks to the police department and he says, oh, we need more police officers. How is all of this paid for, Dave?
Well, by taxpayers, and at some point the rubber will meet the road, and the mayor will have to sort of help make the books balance. Let me just be a little, defensive, if you will, for the pay raises. The council and mayor haven't had a raise for 8 years. They will not now have another raise for 4 years, so that's a 12-year period with a 15% raise. That's about 1% a year. That's not excessive for a difficult job. We were suggested they support it. We are also in favor of free buses, in part because it's another $10 million in the budget. Kansas City can find that kind of money. And imagine the transformative effect, Nick, if everyone in this community could get on and off mass transit without having to pay for it. The streetcar proves how well that works. So there are things that the city can do. And by the way, one way to pay for them is to stop handing out big checks to developers for unneeded developments downtown.
I'm all for everybody getting what they're worth, right? I get that. But when you have now council members making the same about Minneapolis and Milwaukee, who are considered full-time, they're considered part-time. You can say they're not part-time, that's fine. And St. Louis council members who are part-time making about $38,000 a year, they're up to now 71 in Kansas City. I think I get it. It's not a big part of the budget. It's not make or break. But principally, I think voters have a right to be upset.
Well, Kansas City has no desire to be St. Louis. I'm just going to put that on the table. No. And two, when it comes to the bus service, public transit, period. To Dave's point, I was surprised when we talked to avid bus riders. They love the streetcar. I thought there would be this huge, right. I thought there would be this huge divide, but Mike, you said it. They love the fact that it is free. And when you're talking about, especially housing, affordably, people being able to get into the city and get to jobs, if you take that off the table and make it where people can get around, I think that's huge for Kansas City.
There's a lot of things we could offer for free, though, in this community that would be transformative, beyond buses, though, Dave.
Well, here's the thing.
Like what?
Time. Here's the thing. To the point about, cops for raises, firefighters for raises. Those are going to be negotiated because of their union. Same thing with Local 500 and public employees in general in Kansas City. The fact is that City Hall is pretty much convinced that Kansas Cityans have had it with tax increases. Yes. And we're not going to see City Hall offering this up for a while. So they can say what they want about raising all the boats in that respect. City Hall's not going to be going to voters for a tax increase in the near
Kansas
future.
City Star ending its subscription for the newspaper. would be transformative.
yeah.
With
Okay, thank
huge
you.
crowds
Not a
watching
good
the
idea.
Women's World Cup live in the Power and Light District and some of the highest TV ratings in the country, the push is on for Kansas City's quest to host a World Cup match in 2026. If Kansas City is awarded a World Cup game, it would be played at Arrowhead Stadium. Other cities are now calculating what this is going to cost them. Seattle claims the price tag is $10 million. Orlando says they could be on the hook for $40 million or more when you tally up the cost of safety and security, traffic, transportation, FanFest activities. Could that be why cities like Chicago and Las Vegas both dropped out of the bidding, Dia?
I think they are dropping out because they're realizing they may not have as good of a shot as they thought.
Okay.
Let's be real. I'm a sports fan, full disclosure. We all know this. Yes, you're going to spend a little bit of money up front for safety, for security, for all the things you have to do infrastructure-wise. The World Cup is the biggest sporting event in the world. You definitely want it in your backyard. The influx, the visibility for the city, the amount of money that brings in for restaurants, businesses, hotels, we now have an abundance of in the city. I think it's a great thing. So, yeah, it's going to cost a little more money, but I think the energy is there. I think the time is right for Kansas City to bring a World Cup here. And nobody's going to complain when the streets are flooded.
Who pays for it?
Taxpayers pay for it, and I'm a big soccer fan specifically, and I think that there needs to be some caution moving forward on this. I think Kansas City's pretty well suited to get at least some of the World Cup games, primarily because a lot of the facilities are already in place, including Sporting Park, Arrowhead, as well as the training center out in Bonner Springs. That's very important. But the idea of, and Dave, you and I have known this for years, cities saying, well, the economic impact of this is going to be $17 gazillion. That's never the case, okay? And the ability for cities to recover this money is going to be problematic. And on top of this, you're dealing with FIFA, which governs soccer around the world, and it is a very corrupt organization. And you got to watch every penny you deal with these guys because they'll take you for a ride. So, yeah, I hope Kansas City gets it, but do this with caution.
You know, Nick, we talked a few weeks ago about the NFL draft coming to town. Huge fan of that, huge proponent. A little more cautiously optimistic. Now, if Dia's right, if it turns into a net positive when it comes to the bottom line, then so be it. That would be great. But the concern still has to be, is it going to work? To Mike's point, the taxpayer being on the hook for this, it's great, it would look good, but is it right for the city? And that remains to be seen.
I'll try and say this quickly, but broaden out the discussion a little bit. There was a lot of talk after the Women's World Cup about all the pictures from the Power and Light District and what a great thing for Kansas City, 10,000 people there.
I know where you're
As
going.
if that justifies the renovations downtown. But Kansas City taxpayers put in about between $12 and $14 million a year for 30 years or more to provide that venue. That money would almost perfectly provide free bus service. Now, which is more important to Kansas City? 10,000 people downtown for the World Cup, Women's World Cup, or free bus service? You could make an argument for either one, but Kansas City needs to have that conversation, make that decision, and decide who deserves that kind of support.
And just one thing to put on the table. Yes, some of the money will likely come from taxpayers when you talk about public safety and things like that. But there is also a huge fundraising push. That's where the host committee comes in. So I agree, you have to watch it like a hawk, but I do think there are a lot of steps in this process. People shouldn't be scared.
Wanted a new head for Johnson County Community College and a new police chief in Kansas City, Kansas. What is going on in our city this week that many people think, you know, this is a great time to retire?
Hello, my name is Joe Sopcich, and I'm president of Johnson County Community College.
But not for much longer. He's announced he's calling it quits this week after 7 years on the job. And in Kansas City, Kansas, Police Chief Terry Siegler announces he's hanging up his badge and his gun. Both men have been plagued by bad PR lately. The KCK police chief has been on the defensive over a handshake deal that lets him lease a county-owned lake house where the rent is exchanged for fixing up the property. It's been investigated by the KBI. Meanwhile, the head of Johnson County Community College was recently recorded at a Washington hotel justifying a tuition hike by saying there are no poor students at the college. He knows. He's seen their cars in the parking lot. All righty, let's start with the police chief. Is there any connection between that KBI probe against him and his decision to leave, Michael?
The timing seems suspicious on this because I don't think there was any indication that Ziegler was going to wrap up his career immediately. Several months ago, there's been pressure on the police department from the More Squared group and some other progressives about how officers treat certain parts of certain people in their community. I don't think that the Lake House is a big deal, but I think that the pressure on the department of late might have more to do with it than anything else.
What about for the Johnson County Community College president? I mentioned him being picked up in a recording at a Washington hotel saying there were no pool students at JCCC, but I also noticed there are 11 candidates running, the most ever for the Johnson County Board of Trustees. There's a lot of unhappiness there. Does he need to be there as the head of that organization
I'm not sure
with new leadership there?
I'm not sure that there's a lot of unhappiness, Nick, as much as there is an understanding that that's an enormously important asset in the community and that it needs to be well governed in a public way, that they can't just sort of hide in the corner anymore, run a junior college and then call it a day. And so there's competition for those seats, and I think that any chief administrator understands that his or her service might be an issue in those elections, and so I think he's stepping away in part for those reasons. It's going to be tough. There are problems with the adjunct professors out at the community college in terms of how much they get paid and what benefits they're eligible for. The tax rate to support a college of that size is pretty high. So, again, all of these things in one basket may have
And he argues he's been there twice as long as most community college presidents in the country serve.
And here's the other thing, is I don't think there's much doubt that in the next decade, the role of community colleges in America, and specifically here in the Kansas City area, is about to undergo some pretty substantial changes in terms of their role vis-a-vis secondary education in Kansas and in the state of Missouri, and whether or not the next president, certainly if it's a Democrat, there's going to be some pressure on it to make community college tuition free. And there's recognition.
That would be transformative,
yes,
Dave
it
Helling.
would.
Okay.
Yes, it would.
And
which is why it's a good idea.
And this recognition that the community college system is a path toward skilled labor. Their role is going to be increasing dramatically.
And somebody does have to pay, though, for that free community college, just like those other things we talked about. We talked about the police chief
It'll
in
be the World
KCK.
Cup. It'll be the money from the World
Let's
Cup.
stay in Wyandotte County, where the owner of the T-Bones says he plans to sell the team as the baseball club faces mounting debts that they simply can't cover. The T-Bones have been a fixture in Wyandotte County for 16 years. The stadium, once called Community America Ballpark, is now owned by the county, and the baseball club can't keep up with the lease payment. Schlitterborn has already closed. Is it conceivable that this other big attraction in KCK will close too?
I didn't think that anything was new here. I mean, they've struggled financially for a while. When I talked to someone with the county or the unified government, they basically told me they have a power bill and debt that they just can't cover. They had a seller in mind, but the seller didn't want to pick up the debt. So we're back where we've been with the T-Bones. I don't know how long this has been going on.
Pretty easy fix here. Royals, look at the crowds there, have them play a few games at T-Bones, try to get it going again, and away we go. I think that's an easy fix for all.
That's a non-starter.
I'm joking.
The other thing that's really troubling about this, when you get right down to it, they can't pay their light bill. That's a big sign. That's a big sign of trouble.
Do you think they're going to close?
Don't know enough about it to make a call.
Alrighty, we can talk about the big political stories on this program. That does not mean that's what you're paying attention to. Nationally, the biggest story coming out of Kansas City this week was Patrick Mahomes coming out of Kansas City, of course, winning the NFL Player of the Year award. And then we saw the criminal caught by Liberty Police when he gives up his location due to excessive flatulence. Yes, that's even made Canadian news. Checking out the Kansas City Star's top trending stories as we were producing this program. One of them was about the woman who started shooting out a DMV office in Kansas City North because the line was too slow. And the second and third highest clicked stories were Chiefs fans sounding off after a full audio recording of Tyreek Hill and his fiancée is aired.
If you hear the entire context of what we aired today on 610, you'll definitely get a different impression, probably a more positive impression of Tyreek Hill than you had before.
Hey, Dear Wall, you were tracking this story. What was so revealing that we didn't know before?
One, how vehemently he denies everything that happened in 2014. I think some of the editing of the audio recording was a little bit, I think, concerning for Chiefs fans and other people listening to it. Let's be real, nobody is exonerating Tyreek Hill and saying that this is an upstanding, great guy and he's off the hook. But when you are pressing him and it's well known that you know you're recording this conversation and he doesn't, and you're saying, well, why would he say that you hit him and all these other things? You keep the front half and then you cut off his response, which says, but you know how I am with kids. I love my son. I would never do anything to hurt my son. That's a little, I think, important to include. And I think in an era now where transparency and us doing our jobs well and fairly, you can think whatever you want about them, but it's our job to be as fair and down the middle as we possibly can.
For months, there has been the conversation in Kansas City, for those who so care about this, that it's just going to be a matter of time. He's going to be gone from the Chiefs. Does this change this whole calculation? And he could be suiting up with the Chiefs again as we begin a new season?
Well, I think the NFL, they obviously had the whole recording. They've heard this, so they knew behind the scenes what we did not know, which is here's what's actually on the tape. My fear is that we're going to go from one pendulum and swing it all the way back to the other end, which I would not want to do.
And I noticed in the editorial board of the Kansas City Star saying, actually, the recording made him look worse, not better.
Right. There are different interpretations of what people heard on that tape. The real question is what punishment, if any, the NFL will impose. We do expect that maybe this week or perhaps next. And then there will be a reaction to that because, as Dia suggests, whatever you think of the tape, no one would endorse the behavior of Tyreek Hill throughout this episode, and the NFL has some important, difficult decisions to make.
And that is our week in review. Our thanks to this week's news reviewers from KMBC 9 News, Michael Mahoney, and from the pages of your Kansas City Star, Dave Helling. Reporting and anchoring at 41 Action News, Dia Wall, and getting up earlier than anyone should have to dissect the news on KCMO Talk Radio, Pete Mundo. And I'm Nick Haynes. From all of us here at KCPT, thanks for spending part of your weekend with us.